Hello everyone, I'm Inverse, and it's been a while. I think it's been almost a month since my last upload here on YouTube. I've been streaming a lot over on Twitch TV, but actually have not gotten around to rounding up a few replays and doing a video in quite some time. So hopefully this will be breaking that trend, and we'll get back into the general swing of things. I was covered for about a week and a half there. With work excuses, but the other week and a half, 2 weeks, was laziness. So I apologize, but I'm back now, and I'm gonna be revisiting a old series, about a month and a half, 2 months maybe old, U.S. vs. PE case studies series, and I'm going to be doing my second installment in that series right here. We're gonna be doing a strategy that I've fallen in love with very recently. Now, I was going to wait and do this strategy a little bit later on, get a few more obscure US vs. PE strategies in the series before I tackled this one, since I believe this is one of, if not the most solid US vs. PE strategy I'll be going over in this series. But I've been playing nothing but this. Aimstrong recently released a replay pack of this strategy, and I love it. I think it's great. A lot of you probably already know what this is, so we're gonna get going, and I'll explain things as we go. We got 3 replays to go through today, and this is actually a very interesting situation, because this is a very old strategy that's only very recently gained a lot of popularity, at least in my sphere of things, and at least in the attention of the Company of Heroes community, especially on game replays, thanks to Aimstrong's most recent replay pack. Now, this is a strategy that I first saw and remember first seeing way back in February of 2012 in a game replays tournament, in a game between Aimstrong and Guderian. This is actually the game we'll be watching right now. This is from a good, what would that be? A while back. I'm not going to try to do the mental math right now. It's from a while back, and it's very interesting. We'll see how the strategy has evolved, or rather how it hasn't really evolved, and how steady and how strong it's actually been, and how successful Aimstrong manages to make this strategy, considering how long it's been around. Now, with that in mind, let's go into the specifics of the actual build. As you've probably noticed already, we have a slight variation already. We have 3 engineers start, and we had a funky little barracks build there in the middle. We had the first pioneer kind of build up to about 2/3, we'll say. Then the second built pioneer coming in to finish it. That's not something we're going to focus on too much this game. This game's going to be more getting the general feel for the strategy, get the feel for how Aimstrong likes to play this strategy, and the general philosophies behind this strategy. We're just going to wait for something to happen. And okay. See, when I first watched this replay, I was like, he just lost a Panzer Grenadier squad to an engineer. Guderian. That's rather embarrassing, but I'm glad I was wrong, so that helps things out a little bit right now. Alright, so we have a fairly standard opening going on right now. We had a single rifle squad come out. We're going to have a second one come out right now. We have this engineer squad actually not reinforcing, which is an interesting choice, definitely something that you can do. And what this is going to do is it's going to give Aimstrong a slightly quicker third rifle squad. Actually, what I believe he did here was neglected to reinforce this engineer squad until after this second rifle squad was in production. So we see right here he's just waiting by the barracks. He's going to reinforce this squad eventually. There we go. As for capping order, nothing too extreme. We saw 2 engineers on this left-hand side actually go in and engage the Panzer Grenadiers and actually do a lot of damage. That's a very important part of this strategy that takes a little bit of getting used to, because generally speaking in the early game, your mind kind of tells you that engineers against Panzer Grenadiers is not a good fight for the engineers. But it's actually not too bad to engage early game Panzer Grenadiers with engineers, especially if you have multiple engineers. 2 engineers will actually fairly handily defeat a single Panzer Grenadier squad, And even if you only have one engineer, it's never a bad idea to engage a Panzer Grenadier squad with that one engineer, because you're going to deal some decent health damage at the very least, and that's going to make subsequent battles a lot easier to deal with. Now, of course, you might be asking yourself, well, that means I take damage on my engineers as well. Isn't that kind of not a good trade? Because the Panzer Grenadiers obviously, generally speaking, have better damage output than vanilla engineers, and that's definitely true. However, healing in this strategy in particular is going to play a larger role, specifically with regards to a fairly early triage center that we're going to see in the fairly near future, and that kind of helps out in that situation. Obviously, you never want to take damage on any of your squads, but damage on an engineer in exchange for damage on a Panzer Grenadier, almost always a trade you want to be making. Now we're going to see right here a little flank come in with a Flamer squad. An early Flamer squad is an integral portion of this strategy. It's a very munitions heavy strategy because it relies on unorthodox methods of countering vehicles, namely sticky bombs, which we're going to see in the very near future as the 4th Rifle Squad comes up, as we see right here. This is a very unique strategy in the way it deals with both vehicles and infantry, and as a result, it requires a fairly hefty sum of munitions, and it's just something to keep in mind when you're thinking about, hey, should I be capping over here? Should I maybe be capping over here? Should I be, I don't know, capping as munitions or as fuel? Which one do I want to be going for first? Something to keep in mind is just how important it is to secure munitions with a strategy such as this. Now, as we notice this game, we've had a fairly heavy, I'd say we've had a moderate number of Panzer Grenadiers constructed in this game. We've had, I believe, 3, perhaps 4. Generally speaking, 2 Panzer Grenadiers is a low number. Anything above 4, 5 plus, something like that, we're going to consider a fairly high number of Panzer Grenadiers. This is a pretty medium number of Panzer Grenadiers and doesn't really tell you too much about what your opponent might be doing. In a lot of situations, the best read you can get on your opponent's teching choice is the number of Panzer Grenadiers they've purchased, because obviously Panzer Grenadiers a fairly hefty amount of manpower. Furthermore, you need to be reinforcing all of those Panzer Grenadiers, which is a further sink on your manpower. And the more Panzer Grenadiers you purchase, as a rule, the later the PE player's actual tech is going to be. And as we see right here, an infantry half-track. This is a slightly unorthodox infantry half-track build, at least in comparison to more traditional infantry half-track builds, which tend to be 2 PG, 2 Panzer Grenadier, and then 2 half-tracks after that. This is a far heavier Panzer Grenadier focus in the early game, but can possibly throw off an American player. Now, it's never a bad idea on a map such as this, simply because Panzer Grenadiers can be so powerful against many American early games, simply because if you look at the resource split and the resource distribution of the map, especially with regards to fuel, this battle is going on, and we saw the sticky bombs, so we have the sticky bombs now. But as I was saying, with regards to distribution of fuel, if you look at the tactical map, we have 2 main sources of fuel completely opposite each other, fairly close to cutoffs. Cutoffs themselves fairly close to one another. These 2 points actually not too far away. It's very easy as a Panzer Grenadier player to send a couple PGs, your first 2 PGs, to one of these fuel points, send your Kettenkrad to the other fuel point, and essentially completely deny your opponent fuel for the super early game. That's not what Guderian elected to do in this match, which is perfectly fine. It's perfectly valid to not play that way, but it's something you have to keep in mind as an American player, and it's something you have to be able to react to, and it's a reason why I like this strategy so much and I feel it's so incredibly powerful, is the fact that it allows for that flexibility and that on-the-fly modification far easier than something like a straight fast M8 or the CT-SEOC style of play we went over in the last videos, or in the last US vs PE case study specifically. Enemy unit down. Now we're moving into the mid to late game part of the strategy. We're about 8 minutes in. things happen fairly quickly with this strategy. You're very infantry heavy. You're not worried too much about the vehicles your opponent produces, and you're more worried about doing as much damage as possible while getting tech up behind it. Now, what you want to be doing as a follow-up to this strategy is almost always tank depot. Tank depot is a very integral part of a strategy such as this, because your early game investment in sticky bombs gives you a decent amount of strength, but not enough strength to deal with a massive blob of, say, armored cars, something like that. And that's a problem that the CT Siak style of play that I went over before kind of runs into in some situations, is the fact that your opponent can pretty much straight up build ACs, and you can't really punish him for being greedy in that regard. What I mean by being greedy is your opponent's not, he doesn't have to take into consideration anything else you might be doing. You're invested pretty heavily in infantry. You're invested pretty heavily with that strategy in paratroopers as a primary form of anti-tank. And as a result, your opponent can pretty safely say, all right, I'm just going to build a ton of ACs and, you know, come and kill me. And it's going to be my AC micro against your half micro, half luck in that situation, just because of the general nature of paratroopers in that matchup and against those units, the armored cars. Whereas this strategy says, all right, I'm going to go infantry heavy in the early game. If you go anything other than armored car, I'm going to be extremely far ahead. That's what this strategy does. If your opponent doesn't go fast armored car, you're in an excellent spot. We saw how effective not even the sticky bombs was against that infantry half track, but the fact that you have fully healed rifles because of this triage center, you have a couple of flamers to very quickly deal with the Panzer Grenadier infantry around the half tracks, because that's a big problem with infantry half-track based builds in general, is the fact that your opponent can just kind of sit beside the infantry half-track and you can't out-DPS him over and above his healing and reinforced capabilities, which is the main problem, is the fact that your opponent's almost always going to be able to reinforce faster than you can kill him unless you have a couple of flamers. And two flamers, watching a lot of Aimstrong's games in his replay pack, seems to be the number he favors in the early game. It obviously depends a lot on map, on munitions income, because you do need to keep a generous, decent, I'd say at least one sticky bomb worth of munitions in your munitions inventory, just in case you see an opportunity or your opponent pushes or something like that, just to be safe. You're almost always going to want at least one sticky bomb's worth of munitions available. But aside from that, it's very, very important to be getting as many flamers as possible. In a lot of Aimstrong's games, we actually see him build an additional 4th engineer and sometimes even a 5th engineer, just in order to get the additional power that those extra flamers afford him. Now at this point we have very nice map control by Aimstrong. This is a fairly straightforward game from this perspective. This isn't so much a, hey, let's showcase how cool this strategy is, but more a, hey, let's figure out what this strategy entails, how it's supposed to be played, how Aimstrong specifically likes to play it, because of course you're not going to necessarily have to play it the same way as Aimstrong does. Aimstrong's method definitely one of the best ways to play a strategy such as this, no doubt about it. But there's definitely modifications and there's specificities that Aimstrong has incorporated in terms of what he techs to first, what he techs to second, and stuff like that. And we'll get more into the nitty-gritty details in the next game. But I just wanted to kind of highlight and outline just how cool I find this strategy to be and why I find it to be that cool. Because it's honestly, in my opinion, the most, I'm trying to figure out how to word this without sounding cheesy, because it's very difficult. I want to be like, it's fabulous, it's marvelous, anything like that, because that's just nonsense. It's probably the best US versus PE strategy I've seen in ever, really. Outside Fast M8, this is the first strategy that I can look at and say, I could see this working in almost every single game if I play it correctly. In a lot of situations, I can see this working better than a fast M8. In almost every situation, the one situation being a fast armored car, and we'll see later how Aimstrong actually deals with that fast armored car situation. In almost every other situation outside of that one, I don't see this strategy being inferior to anything else. At least in the current metagame, with the way Panzer Elite players are playing right now, and with the way this strategy allows American players to play. It's very interesting dynamic. It's nothing like what we've seen in the matchup, and I haven't really found, or I haven't seen anything like that, a very powerful way for a Panzer Elite player to actually overcome something like this. And we'll see a few different methods that different players have come up with in the next two videos, or in the next two in the next two games rather. But that was just kind of an introduction, a little teaser, and we'll be going into a little bit more depth with the next game. So I'll see you guys in a little bit. Alright guys, we're back with game number 2. We're going to be on the same map, same general situation, slightly different response from our opponent, and of course a slightly different opponent. Let's get things started. This is a game against Silence from Aimstrong's most recent replay pack, which you can find on GameReplays.org. I'll leave a link in the description of this video, so you guys should definitely, I encourage you to check that out. We're going to see a few slight modifications from Aimstrong in this game. This is obviously a game that was played much later, much more recently rather, than the game against Guderian that we just looked at. But we're going to actually notice that not much has changed. The general gist of the build, which of course, if it wasn't clear from the last video, is a 3-engineer start, followed by 4 rifles, and then followed by sticky bombs, and a triage center. Now the ordering of that is going to be important. That's going to be something we're going to take a look at in this game, especially with regards to relations between this game and the last game. Now if we look at the barracks building, in this situation we have a different action than we had in the last game. We obviously have this engineer completely building this barracks. Now that is for a multitude of reasons. 2 reasons that I can just off the top of my head come up with. Now first of all, if we look at the timing of that barracks, that was the 2nd engineer that built that barracks. We still had a lot of manpower in that situation, and we had almost 270 by the time the barracks was built. Now if this squad hadn't completely finished this, we probably would have had around 300 manpower when the time came to actually produce that first rifle squad. So on this map, in these starting positions, this is the only map and starting positions that I see Aimstrong doing something like that. I encourage you to not split up the build times in this situation. Of course, we're going to see in the next game on a different map a situation where it's advantageous to do something such as that. Now, another reason for that, for the straight build of the barracks in this situation, was the fact that that building engineer, as we saw up here, was actually able to head up here, plant some wire right here. This is a very interesting wire placement, especially against Panzer Elite, because a lot of very aggressive PE players like to send their first 1 or 2 Panzer Grenadier squads straight to this house, camp the cutoff, and then they have their first Ketten over here, and they're capping this field, and their main goal is to throw you off, because a lot of American players who start bottom, just by habit, instinctually, they're going for this right-hand side field point. That can be a very annoying situation to deal with, which is why Aimstrong, number 1, he planted this wire. Number 2, he has this first rifle squad here, and he had this first rifle squad here the moment he had it created. Now, as we see, Aimstrong's not really sure. He's seen 1 PG. He's not really sure what his opponent is doing. There's a lot of different routes that the PE player could be taking in this situation. 2 Ketten, of course, is a possibility, though with that early Panzer Grenadier, it's not likely. Now, we see a very aggressive push with 3 Panzer Grenadiers right here, and a 4th Panzer Grenadier right here we saw just as a tiny little blip dealt some damage to this engineer. So we have four Panzer Grenadier squads very early on. Now that by itself doesn't necessarily tell us anything, but the aggressiveness with which our Panzer Elite player Silence is using his Panzer Grenadier squads definitely suggests a Panzer Grenadier heavy opening and a very aggressive infantry opening, which generally is not infantry half-tracks. Infantry half-tracks, because you need to tech up, you need to spend time and units building the tech building, you need to spend money, obviously, building the tech building. You're going to have, just by virtue of the fact that you're teching, a smaller in size army, and you're not really going to be able to, as a Panzer Elite player, be as aggressive as Silence is being in this situation, simply because you can't afford to be reinforcing before your infantry half-tracks come out. You want to be you want to be teching as hard as you can until you get to those infantry half-tracks, because that's where your strength comes in exploiting those units that you spent so much time and so much money on. Now we see two more Panzer Grenadiers over here, so we can pretty much certainly rule out any sort of infantry half-track play, and it kind of becomes a toss-up after that point. Now the main follow-up, the primary follow-up in a situation such as this would be fast armored cars. And that's generally speaking the safe, standard, normal way that a lot of PE players follow up a very Panzer Grenadier heavy opening, because it gives them some map control, it gives them the capacity to deal damage, and it allows them to force out an M8 and use it as bait for an AT half-track, stuff like that. Now obviously that is not in the cards for our American player in this game, but it's something to keep in mind when analyzing what the Panzer Elite player is doing and why he's playing the way he is. Now if we look at the order of operations in Aimstrong's base in this situation, if you noticed, if you were really paying attention last game, we had sticky bombs researched before we had a triage center, and the main reason for that was what the Panzer Elite player showed in terms of his aggressiveness, in terms of the presence and number of Panzer Grenadiers on the field. We had 3 Panzer Grenadiers on the field pretty much the whole time, and they weren't being too overly aggressive. I believe we may have gone up to 4 in that situation, I'm not quite sure. But in that situation there was a distinct lack of aggression, and there was a lot more downtime in between harassment on the Panzer Elite players, on the part of the Panzer Elite player rather. And that's a pretty large telltale sign of teching, at least on the Panzer Elite player's part. Simply because the units that the Panzer Elite player is going to want to be fighting with are also the units the Panzer Elite player needs to be building with. Now in this situation we have a lot more Panzer Grenadiers in the early game, at least compared to the last game. Anything above 4 generally considered a large number of Panzer Grenadiers in the early game, as I mentioned last game. And with that in mind, Aimstrong says to himself, you know what, this is perfectly safe. I can get a slightly earlier triage center. I don't need my sticky bombs as early. I'm going to plant a mine just to be safe. We're going to see a few mines being planted by Aimstrong throughout the series, and that's something I'll touch on at a later time, on the effectiveness of mines against PE, and more specifically the effectiveness of mines in this strategy, which is a topic of debate a lot of the time in the US vs PE matchup, simply because of the capabilities of Kettenkreis and Schwimmwagens. I'm not German, so I apologize if I butchered that word, because I most certainly did. But as we see, we do have the sticky bombs coming out. So Aimstrong adhering to that formula despite not having actually seen any vehicles yet. Of course, there we have the first armored car. So we do have a different tech route by our Panzer Elite player this game, at least compared to the last game. And we're going to see how Aimstrong approaches this situation a little bit differently, how he decides to cope with the Panzer Elite player's armored cars, and how it's slightly different, though in the same in principle, to how he deals with the infantry half-tracks. And the main theory is keeping rifle squads as close together as possible. You'll notice capping pretty much around a single area, allowing for the fact that hey, these armored cars, they're pretty effective, but in all honesty, the main problem with armored cars, at least in the US vs. PE matchup, for the American player, it's the fact that armored cars are a lot like Pumas. They're in fact almost identical to Pumas in their damage dealing capacities. And with that, I mean, armored cars, they do a decent amount of damage, but they don't actually kill that much. And when they kill, it's because the units being attacked were low on health to begin with. That's when armored cars, Pumas and ACs especially, actually deal like manpower damage, actually kill units. They don't really kill units when the units are at completely full health. And with that in mind, this triage center, if we think about it in terms of investments towards countering ACs, actually does wonders for us. Hey, we have every single squad at completely full health every single time it hits the field. That's drastically reducing the effectiveness of armored cars. It's completely negating the risk of an armored car popping out and then bam, you have a low health squad, it's dead. You can retreat it instantly, it doesn't matter. On retreat, the armored car is going to kill it. It was at such low health. It completely negates that worry in you as the American player's mind, and it frees you up to be a lot more aggressive with your rifles. And we're going to see Aimstrong do things that most American players, if you went on the Gaming Replays American Strategy forums and you told people, you know, you see an armored car, blob your rifles, run at him, and hope he stands there. People would look at you like you were crazy. They would laugh you off. But that's not the point. The point is, with what we have to work with in this situation, we're going to be teching to tanks eventually. As we mentioned in the last video, that's the punishment for our opponent going armored cars. It's the fact that our opponent has to balance the number of armored cars he gets with the time in which he starts investing in tank counters. Because if he just straight up goes hard on the armored cars, which is something we're going to see Silence do in this game, it's not going to work out very well for him. It's not a viable way to counter a strategy such as this. And the beauty of this strategy is the fact that the main method of countering an infantry heavy style of play for a Panzer Elite player is armored cars. Armored cars are the primary means of anti-infantry damage in the mid to late game for a Panzer Elite player. Panzer Grenadiers are extremely expensive. They're extremely weak when compared to vetted rifles. They're extremely weak when compared to flamers, especially when those flamers are used in conjunction with rifles.
Enemy unit down.
And you have Panzer IVs. Panzer IVs, however, come extremely late. It's extremely difficult against a strategy such as this to actually survive long enough to get to armored cars, because the infantry strength of a strategy such as this, we have seven capable fighting units in the mid game with this strategy. We have 4 rifles, all of them fully healed, and we have between 3 and 4 engineers, all of them with flamethrowers. That's an extremely scary infantry force for any Panzer Elite player to deal with. Now, if we look at the Panzer Elite player's options in a situation like that, we have mass PGs. Mass PGs can be effective to a point, but when it comes to focus firing and the raw area of effect damage of 3 or 4 flamer engineer squads, it just doesn't become economically feasible for a Panzer Elite player to focus so heavily on an infantry on an infantry tech that's being completely and directly countered by what you as the American player is doing. This is pretty much the best situation a Panzer Elite player could find himself in against a strategy such as this. There's not really, like, Panzer IVs come too late. Mortar half-track, any sort of half-track is not going to have the survivability nor the damage output to compete with a strategy such as this. Infantry half-tracks, far too weak against small arms fire to be effective against a mass rifle assault. Armored cars, extremely weak against small arms fire in a mass straight-up assault. They do more damage, obviously, than the infantry half-tracks, but it's not really feasible to be running around with a bunch of armored cars when your opponent, as we see right here, a 14-minute M18, which isn't lightning quick. When you compare that to an M8 that you can get around the 8 minute 30 second mark. So we have a solid 6-minute window between when an M8 comes out and when an M18 can come out, and that's of course in this game situation. It could be faster or slower depending on a lot of different factors, so that's not really the point. But if we look at what our opponent has right now, he's dipped a lot of manpower and a lot of fuel in a pair of armored cars. And what good are those pair of armored cars right now? What damage have those pair of armored cars dealt to justify their costs? And in this situation, you can't really justify the costs of these armored cars. This one's going to die very soon. Better die, because it would make me look like a fool otherwise, but I've already watched the game, so I know it dies. Spoilers! So yeah, that one dies. And we're going to actually have another one built. And at that point, it's a difficult situation for a Panzer Elite player to be in, because how do you balance out what you need to be countering? You have tanks, and you have and you have an infantry force which is superior to yours. What do you do in a situation such as that to give yourself an advantage? Do you hedge your bets on anti-infantry? Do you hedge your bets on anti-tank? Whichever way you go, the American player has you covered, and that's why I like this strategy so much, and that's why I think it's one of, if not the best and most stable ways to play the matchup. It's just because no matter what happens, you have a contingency plan to deal with it. It's not like CTCX strategy where, hey, I need to either A, be a god with my paratroopers, B, hope my opponent screws up, or C, just get really lucky with recoilless rifles and have none of them phase through ACs and kill. That's the situation a lot of the time when you play CTCX strategy. Now the two are extremely similar in terms of their emphasis on infantry in the early game and their emphasis, relatively speaking, on tanks in the late game. And the general philosophy behind the two and how they think about the matchup, it's very similar. The execution is extremely different though. And when we look at Aimstrong's style, especially in comparison to CTCX style, it's far easier to punish a greedy Panzer Elite player and to force the Panzer Elite player to invest in technologies and invest in units that he may not necessarily want to be investing in at that given point in time. Like this game, we didn't have Silence lose an armored car poorly to sticky bombs. We had an armored car get stickied, but we had it survive. We have one armored car die, which in this game was to the M18. This isn't an unusual position for a Panzer Elite player to be in. This isn't an extremely disadvantaged position for the Panzer Elite player to be in. We have maybe one Panzer Grenadier lost. We do have no rifle squads lost, which is extremely important. This is a strategy that assumes that you're not going to screw up and lose all of your infantry.
Enemy unit down.
Second Panzer Grenadier squad dies just as I say that. Should have kept my mouth shut. Sorry, silence. But yeah, this is a strategy that assumes, hey, you're going to be okay with your infantry. I don't think that's an unrealistic assumption to make, personally. I think you should definitely play expecting to not lose infantry squads. But it's a very fluid style of play, and it's a very entertaining style to both play and watch, and it's a very powerful style because it's very easy to adapt to what your opponent is doing because you don't really have to adapt. That's the nice thing. What's the adaptations that Aimstrong's made between this game and the last game? He got his triage center before his sticky bombs. he got a 200 manpower 20 fuel building before an 80 manpower 25 fuel upgrade that you can build independently. So you can technically get both your triage center and your sticky bombs at the exact same time. That's not an unrealistic assumption to make. This is a game where Silence didn't make large blunders. Sure, he could have played things differently, and if we look in retrospect, there are a number of things that Silence could have done better and or differently. But this isn't an unrepresentative US versus PU game. This is very representative of the matchup. This is very representative of how people currently play the matchup, at least from the Panzer Elite side. And it gives a nice little window of insight into what a strategy like this actually looks like against what most Panzer Elite players are doing these days. And it looks pretty good. So with that in mind, I'm just going to speed things up. There's not much else to see here. Just some pretty explosions. Lots of stuff's blowing up. Actually, don't know. Oh, one thing blew up. Is another thing going to blow up? It's a lot of flamers. Anything? My game. Slowing down! Slowing down! Go. Come on. I'm running out of things to say. Finish the game. Ah, GG! Play back over. Come on. Yay, game over. Alright, game 3. In a minute. See ya. Alright guys, welcome back. Let's jump into game number 3. Is this started yet? Nope. There we go. Yikes. Alright, game number 3. This is going to be a game, of course, between Aimstrong and our friendly neighborhood Go Pepsi Live. Now, this is going to be a game on Samoa. It's going to be a slightly different execution. Of course, the exact same build. We're going to see very similar philosophy between this game and the previous games. That is, the last 2 games we had an unconventional single infantry half-track start. We had a relatively standard aggressive PG start into armored cars, and we saw how both of those situations kind of played out in the context of this strategy, and the ways in which Aimstrong subtly, is that even a word? Subtly, whatever, I'm going with it. If it's not a word, I apologize. Subtly modified his early game, his mid game, and not so much his late game, but his early game and his transitioning into the mid game with his infantry upgrades and the orders in which he wanted to get them, and also with the ways in which he deployed his infantry. Most notably, keeping his rifle squads together for a lot of the mid game in order to fend off armored cars, and using flamers in conjunction with rifles quite frequently. Also, not obsessing himself with early fuel capture, making sure to balance fuel with munitions. Now, that's a very important point that a lot of American players neglect in the US versus PE matchup, is the simple fact that a lot of these new strategies that are coming out are strategies that absolutely require a at least decent munitions income to execute successfully. And this strategy, I'd say more so than a lot of the other ones, is a strategy in which the more munitions you have, the better off you're going to be. The more munitions you have, the more flamers you're going to be able to afford, while also affording sticky bombs, and the more comfortable you're going to be going into the mid game, because you're going to have the security of multiple sticky bombs and the infantry strength of multiple flamers. And both of those are desirable to have in a situation such as this, where you're relying on relatively squishy infantry for the brunt of your damage output, which is a lot different from a traditional fast M8 style of play, a rifle style of play, in which situation your riflemen aren't really combatants. You're not really fighting with your riflemen in a fast M8 style of play, in a fast M8 build. You're using your rifles to harass, to cap, to delay your opponent. In this style, you're using your rifles to kill stuff. You're using your rifles to deal damage because you want veterancy. You want your opponent to have less manpower. You want to be fighting. But most importantly, you want to be picking favorable fights, because in the US versus PE matchup, it's a lot of very high DPS units doing a lot of damage over a very short period of time, and it's very important for you to be able to very quickly realize if this is a fight you want to take or if this is a fight you want to run away from, because you'll deal a lot of damage very quickly to your Panzer Elite opponent if you have the strength and the units to actually push him off. But your opponent is going to be dealing damage to you just as fast if it so happens that he has the units to win the battle. It's a very interesting dynamic that comes into play in this matchup, because it's not the traditional US versus Wehrmacht kind of back and forth gentle way in which you can play, where, you know, I might push in here and then, oh, I can't, so I'm going to retreat. It's not quite like that. It's, I'm going to commit to a fight and you're going to commit to a fight, because if we run away, we give up too much after we've begun fighting. Now, there's situations where you come into a fight and you instantly realize, hey, this isn't going to work. I need to get out of here. And there's going to be situations where your Panzer Elite opponent's going to do the exact same thing. But there's going to be situations, and there's a lot of situations in a lot of games where you say, hey, I think I can take this, and your opponent says, you know, I think I can take this. And the winner of that one skirmish is more often than not going to win the entire game. That's just the nature of the damage output of units, more notably on the Panzer Elite side, but also with flamethrowers and stuff like that on the American side. And that's one of the reasons why a lot of people don't like the matchup. I personally find it very exciting, and I find it a lot faster paced than a lot of US versus Wehrmacht styles. But that's neither here nor there, really. Let's get back to this actual game. Fast infantry half-track, once again coming out from Pepsi. If we noticed, a moderate number of Panzer Grenadiers as well this game. This wasn't a hardcore infantry half-track rush with 2 Panzer Grenadiers, anything like that. There was a decent amount of aggression going on, but we still have from Aimstrong the very early sticky upgrade. You can see before the Triage Center. So we don't have, we didn't have a very heavy Panzer Grenadier count early game, and with that in mind, Aimstrong electing for the fairly quick sticky bomb upgrade. Now there's a second metric that you can use to determine when you're getting sticky bombs first and when you're getting Triage Center first, and that's pretty much simply the fact that, hey, do I have an engineer in my base to build my Triage Center? Because if you don't, why wouldn't you just get your sticky bomb upgrade? When you think of the economics of the sticky bomb upgrade, we have an upgrade that costs 80 manpower and 25 fuel. That's essentially nothing. When you think about it, that's a very minuscule amount of resources, especially when the other thing that you're trying to balance it with is 200 manpower, 20 fuel. That's not a lot of resources. That's 280 fuel. No, that's 280 manpower, 45 fuel. And that's fairly easy to come by once you have 3 engineers and 4 rifle squads. So if you don't have an engineer back at your base, all your engineers are capping, or maybe they're getting ready to fight or anything like that, go ahead and get that sticky bomb upgrade. You're going to be getting it eventually anyways, so you might as well have it whenever you can fit it into your build. You don't necessarily be adhering to this strict, rigid, you know, oh, he's got an infantry half track, so, or he's built like 6 PGs, I don't need to get my sticky bombs yet. Get them. If it doesn't delay reinforcements and you can't build a triage center yet because you don't have anyone to build it with, there's absolutely no harm in getting an upgrade that you're going to get anyways at an earlier point in time. Now, if it's going to delay like reinforcements for a very important battle, something like that, you know, maybe you want to hold off. But if it's not going to impact anything other than getting that upgrade a little bit quicker, there's no point in putting it off. Now, as we see right here, very good map control for Aimstrong, and not really much else to say from this point in time, because it's a very straightforward strategy. The more you see it, the more you realize, hey, this is actually pretty simple. Aimstrong's not doing anything fancy. He's not messing around with fancy infantry micro, fancy vehicle micro. He's attacking with large groups, overwhelming his opponent, picking favorable engagements, retreating intelligently, retreating damaged units and units that are obviously being focus fired, and looking for opportunities where his opponent is making a mistake and he's able to capitalize, most importantly with regard to sticky bombs. That's the main reason for the sticky bombs in this strategy. It's a twofold twofold upgrade to have. First of all, you're punishing your opponent for making a mistake. If your opponent, I don't know, maybe he moves in a little too close to you. He's not paying attention when you're attacking him. Maybe he's reinforcing something like that. You are punishing your opponent for making mistakes. You're forcing your opponent to pay extra attention to his units. In a game like Company of Heroes, where players aren't generally intent on playing mechanically sound or anything like that, it's absolutely a good thing to do. It's the reason why grenades work a lot in mid and even lower levels of high level play, is the fact that taxing multitask and taxing your opponent's attention can force mistakes, and if you're completely comfortable with it, there's no reason not to do it. Maybe your opponent doesn't make the mistakes, but maybe he does, and either way, you don't lose anything from that situation. So it's, in that regard, a very powerful strategy. Of course, secondly, it forces your opponent to stay at range. Panzer Elite vehicles are not very effective at range. They don't deal too much damage. Look at this infantry half-track not really dealing any damage really to these rifle squads in cover. Armored cars deal very little damage at range, especially to units in cover. But they take a decent amount of damage from rifle fire, from small arms fire. And if you can force your opponent to stay at range, and force your opponent to engage you in situations that are very favorable to you as the American player and very favorable to the tech and the tech route that you've decided to go down, it can only benefit you. There's nothing bad about this situation right here. This will never be a bad thing for the American player. Sure, you're losing some manpower. Sure, we might have wanted to retreat a little bit earlier. You can nitpick with stuff like that. But generally speaking, keeping the Panzer Elite player occupied and giving you time to cap territory, deal damage, stuff like that, force your opponent to waste the tech investment that he's spent on units not really doing anything. Because in that situation, that infantry half-track was doing very little. You want an infantry half-track to be cutting your opponent off, to be dealing a lot of damage, stuff like that, and that simply won't happen when your opponent has sticky bombs, because it really limits the aggressive potential of that unit. Now, if we look up here, we have a observation post. This is very important with this strategy on Samoa. You're almost always going to want an observation post. You don't really have much fuel income on Samoa. You just have, whoa, that was weird. You have this 1 plus 10 fuel. And of course there's these 2 plus 5 fuel points as well, but these are very inconsistently held. And you can't really rely on having those points. So it's definitely safer to be getting that observation post. And if we look back at the base, we have the tank depot almost finished. We have enough fuel for a M18, so would Aimstrong decide to go with that? He's actually going to lose a rifle squad right there, which was unfortunate, but he's going to kill 2 half-tracks, which is very nice, at least. Maybe I shouldn't have said he was going to kill 2 half-tracks. Is he going to kill 2 half-tracks? I'm pretty sure he's going to kill 2 half-tracks, unless I have a terrible memory. I think he's going to throw another sticky bomb. Yep, there's the other sticky bomb. And he's going to clean this one up with the rifle squad coming in from behind since he was immobilized. So we have 2 half-tracks down. So that was definitely a favorable trade for our American player Aimstrong. That's not really what we want to be focusing on at this point. We're going to have I think we're going to have an M18. We might actually have a Sherman first. I'm trying to remember. I'm pretty sure it's a Sherman. But regardless, M18s are a lot of the time what you want to be getting with a strategy like this. And the reasons for that are fairly simple. They're very good against all Panzer Elite vehicles, really, aside from Panthers, and even then they're not bad. They're cheap, especially fuel-wise, and especially in relation to Shermans, which are fairly expensive both in terms of manpower and in terms of fuel. They're fairly fast. They're relatively alright against infantry. They're of course not as good as Shermans, but they get the job done decently well. And they deal, most importantly, and I've said this before, but they deal a lot of damage to Panzer Elite vehicles, and that's something you really want to be focused on. Now, something I haven't really mentioned too much in any of these games is doctrine choice, or not doctrine, but rather company choice. And the main reason for that is I don't really find it to be too impactful in a strategy such as this. This isn't a strategy like CT-COX where you're going in airborne all the time and you're relying on that company to provide you with something that you can't really provide yourself otherwise. And it's not like a fast M8 where it's so incredibly obvious that something like Armored Company will actually have a tangible immediate benefit like it does with getting a M8 out a little bit quicker. This strategy is a lot more fluid and doesn't really require a company at all. Now, if we look at this game, looking down here, Aimstrong's gone for armor. In the first game, we had Aimstrong go for airborne, and in the second game, Aimstrong went for armor as well. Those are the two companies that we generally see Aimstrong using with this strategy. And when you look at the logistics of the strategy and the specifics of what Aimstrong wants to be doing with his company, I keep calling it doctrine. That's driving me crazy. But if you look at the specifics, it makes sense why he would choose those two companies. If we look at airborne, the benefits airborne provides are munitions heavy. Whoa, go down. The benefits airborne provides are munitions heavy and work best against very heavy infantry styles of play. We noticed in the first game, Aimstrong picked airborne after he had essentially already won the game in order to get a strafe off. In the second game, we had Aimstrong pick armor in a situation where he had already won the game essentially, in order to drop Allied War Machine. So in those two situations we have, alright, the game is already over and this guy's just now picking his doctrine, or his company. That should tell you a few things. First of all, this isn't a strategy that is reliant on a company at all. It isn't a strategy that works overwhelmingly better with one company over another. In fact, I'd say armor is probably the best company. Like the way I look at it, the way I, in my playing of this strategy, have been going about what company I pick is I don't pick anything until I either see an opportunity to use airborne, so in other words see an opportunity to use strafe, until I see a situation where I really need paratroopers and I have the resources, the manpower and the munitions to land those paratroopers and equip them, which has not happened yet. I've probably played about 20-25 games with this strategy now. And otherwise, if I get to Tank Depot, I'm going armor almost all the time. And it's pretty much been armor 90% of the games that I've watched. A lot of the games that I've watched of Aimstrong's, all of the games that I've played have been armor. Never infantry. And this is more a commentary on infantry as a company. I'm going to go back to that and say this happens all the damn time. Pardon my French. If you build, I'm going to pause this for a second because this really annoys me and there's something going on over here, but it's not as important as this because gosh darn it, this is driving me crazy because this happened to me today. No, it happened to me yesterday. And I was watching the replay again and I almost wanted to punch my monitor. If you build your tank depot, like over here say, and you build an M18 and you like right click in the middle of the map, like, hey, move here, dude. He's like, oh, okay. And he like calculates like, all right, it's straight line, so I'm gonna go like all right, let me select you. I'm gonna go like bam 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 bam, like straight through here. All right, like, okay, that sounds good. And then he gets here and he realizes, wait a minute, I actually can't like go over this one area, so I'm gonna start doing the Austin Powers maneuver. You know that from Austin Powers where he's doing like the like 200 point turn, he's like jerking it back and forth and all that. So he's like doing the Austin Powers maneuver trying to get out of the base. He's like driving around, he's like pushing infantry so these rifle squads can't even get out to like do their jobs. And he's gonna finally, let's see, he's gonna finally get out. Yeah, look, he finally gets out. That took him like 20 seconds. How incompetent are you as a tank driver if you can't even get out of your flipping base? Like, go this way. It's like I'm going to start rallying right there and then just have him like drive there and then drive down here, because that absolutely drove me up the wall. What we were talking about, oh yeah, infantry company. So yeah, I don't really find infantry company to be all that effective against Panzer Elite, because Rangers are good, don't get me wrong. Rangers are very good against almost everything Panzer Elite has. They're kind of like tank depot units. Rangers very good against anything that isn't a Panther, essentially. So they're very good in that regard. But aside from that, you don't really get much utility out of infantry company. You get mine laying abilities, which, as I mentioned before, mine laying can be very important to a strategy such as this. It's never a bad idea to lay mines with a strategy such as this. And I'm trying, because I was actually talking about this strategy on my stream tonight before I came on and recorded this video, so I'm not sure what I talked about then and what I talked about earlier in this video now. So I apologize if I'm repeating myself, but I am going to go over mine laying with the strategy once again, just very quickly, and the philosophy behind it, because as you all know, Panzer Elite players are very well equipped to deal with mines. Schwemmwagons, Kettenkrads can detect mines. There's of course Fieldcraft. Panzer Grenadiers can detect mines while standing still with Fieldcraft, stuff like that. For that reason, mines are rarely, if ever, used against Panzer Elite. Yet in the first game, we saw Aimstrong lay a good number of mines. He actually laid 2 mines and tried to lay a 3rd one, but had it cancelled. It's absolutely worth it in a strategy such as this, provided you have the munitions to justify it. And with that, I mean, or the reasoning behind that is, your opponent's vehicles are very important. They're very valuable, they're very expensive, and if he loses one, it's very detrimental. For you, munitions aren't all that important. Of course you want them, but they're much better in play than they are in your inventory. And if you have a decent munitions income, you're not going to be too hard-pressed to find 50 or 75 munitions to throw into mines. You can't win or lose games based on your munitions. Munitions help you win or lose games because they deal manpower damage. You win or lose games based on manpower and how much manpower you kill, how much manpower you lose, how much manpower your opponent has, and how much manpower you have. That's how you win games. And if you can risk 50 or 75 munitions for the chance to kill one of your opponent's most important, most valuable units, which in the early game is generally an armored car, something like that, because if you can get your opponent to hit the mine with an armored car or something like that, you are probably going to kill that armored car with sticky bombs, with just running up and shooting it. Now, of course, in the first game that didn't happen. With Aimstrong's mine, he'd hit the mine, or the armored car rather, hit the mine, and it didn't end up dying. And that's a risk that, that can definitely happen. But more than just dealing the damage and killing the squad is delaying your opponent and forcing your opponent to do something that he might not otherwise want to be doing. You don't ever, as a Panzer Elite player, want to be spending time repairing vehicles. It's very time consuming. It's not something you want to be doing with Panzer Grenadiers especially. So in that situation, I absolutely condone the use of mines. I think mines are absolutely a useful thing to have, a useful thing to place, as long as you do so intelligently and as long as you don't go overboard with it. And that ties back in with my distaste, I guess. That's probably not the right word, but I am very tired because it is almost 1 a.m., so I am having a terrible time picking my words. But yeah, it's not worth it getting defensive operations, which is the mine-laying ability with infantry company, to lay mines against Panzer Elite. You have a lot of engineers with this strategy. Use the engineers to plant the mines. And finally, artillery, which should be straightforward. Nothing Panzer Elite has is stationary. Everything moves. There's half-tracks, there's infantry, there's no MGs, no packs, nothing like that. There's a flak that is rarely, if ever, built, especially against a strategy such as this, because it does not have much utility. And with that, that's about all I wanted to say on this strategy. There's a lot more I could possibly say. I could ramble on for hours discussing something like this. So if you guys have any questions, anything like that, please feel free to post them in the comments. I will do my best to answer everything. This has been my first cast in almost a month, so I'm undoubtedly rusty. I apologize for stumbling over my words and repeating myself and any other such snafus I may have performed over the course of this. How long has it been? It's been an hour, I'd say, almost. But thank you all for watching. As always, please do check me out on Twitch TV. I stream daily. I'll be playing this strategy a lot. A lot of the other strategies you see in my Strat Talk and US vs. PE case study videos, I perform there live, and I commentate myself playing through them, answer questions through the chat and stuff like that. So please do check that out. That is on twitch.tv/InverseTV. Oh, my voice cracked. Oh, I'm losing my voice. Aside from that, I don't really have anything else to say. I will be back in less than 3.5 weeks this time, I promise. Thanks for watching, guys.